So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending this panel. I'm really glad that the committee gave it such an interesting name. I feel like it drew people here. So as you all previously heard, much of my research revolves around visual culture of the majority world and the ways in which Western society interacts both negatively and positively with visual culture of the majority world. My academic doctrine is largely informed by postcolonial and decolonial theory, and I strive to redefine the relationship between the West and what is derogatorily called the rest. So it's through these lenses that I present my research from chop suey to General Tso's chicken, Chinese food as agent of diaspora. So Chinese food has been a part of the American culinary landscape since the arrival of the first Chinese immigrants in San Francisco in 1849. Chinese restaurants can be found everywhere, despite the fact that Chinese Americans constitute such a small percentage of the population. My research examines the roots of the prevalence of Chinese food in America, its evolution into a uniquely diasporic cuisine, and the way it acts as an agent of diaspora itself. I had several questions when I was considering choosing this topic and beginning my research. What would American cuisine be without Chinese food? What would America be without the Chinese diaspora? Can we describe the relationship between America and Chinese food through a diasporic lens? It is my position that Chinese food acts as more than cuisine. It assimilated to American taste while simultaneously remaining exotic and untranslatable to American culture. Through these characteristics, the cuisine has become itself an agent of diaspora. So before unpacking the agency of Chinese food, it's important to lay a framework for the scope of my research and the terms used throughout. The exact definition of diaspora is debated. Are diasporas forced dispersals? Can they refer only to large groups? Are diasporic subjects cosmopolitan? These questions go beyond the scope of this research, but it is important to define diasporic identity and experience. I'm utilizing the theoretical framework of Stuart Hall in his essay, Cultural Identity and Diaspora. He defines diasporic experience not by essence or purity, but by the recognition of a necessary heterogeneity and diversity, by a conception of identity which lives with and through, not despite difference, by hybridity. In the same essay, Hall defines diasporic identity as those which are constantly producing and reproducing themselves anew through transformation and difference. These terms will aid us once we further discuss Chinese food as diasporic agent. So as I said earlier, Chinese immigrants began arriving in San Francisco in 1849, and they proceeded to establish trade networks to transport imported food, drinks, and cooking supplies from China to the West Coast. Chinese restaurants populated the American West in the 1800s and 1900s, and they served both American and Chinese cuisine at cheap prices. However, with growing xenophobia and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, it was not common to admit to liking Chinese food. On the other side of the country, the East Coast did not have the same qualms about Chinese immigrants and their food. In New York City, Chinese immigrants were a drop in the bucket compared to the large numbers of people entering through Ellis Island. In the 1890s, Chinese food gained widespread popularity in New York through the influence of social groups like the Bohemians and their search for authenticity, what is real New York. Noodle houses and chop suey restaurants became a part of the American culinary landscape. They were written about in books, music, and art, like the painting Chop Suey by Edward Hopper. The painting shows two chic women sitting at a table wearing slim-fit clothes, as we can see here. As was the popular style in the 1920s, there's a small teapot on the table in front of them, suggesting that they're enjoying hot tea with their meal. Outside the window from the women is a large red sign covered in lights that the viewer can only read Suey on. To the left of the women sit a couple, a woman in a red hat and a man in a black suit enjoying a cigarette. All of the patrons shown in the scene are white, well-dressed, and sport modern styles. Hopper's conception of the scene suggests the popularity of Chinese restaurants as well as their widespread acceptance even by middle and upper class citizens. At a certain point, Americans did start to tire of chop suey and even Chinese restaurants, but there was a resurgence with General Tso's chicken. It's a meal that can be found on almost every Chinese American menu. General Tso's chicken took off in New York City in the early 1970s and was popularized by chef T.T. Wang, who is often mistakenly credited with inventing the dish. Although he was not the progenitor of the recipe, he adapted it to fit more American tastes and is responsible for the version we know today. Every Chinese restaurant has their own recipe for the sauce, but like chop suey, the main components are the same. According to the documentary, The Search for General Tso, the dish in a way came from the Hunan region in China, but through the hands of Chinese chefs all over America, it has evolved to be anything but authentic Chinese food. Although there have been periods of waning interest in Chinese food, acceptance of the cuisine continues into the modern era. Chinese restaurants are now everywhere across America, from large cities to small towns. The history of Chinese food in America is one of adaptation and hybridity. Chinese food did not simply exist in a vacuum. It reacted to Americans and their tastes, not only from a business standpoint, but in an attempt to garner cultural and racial approval. It is a classic tale of diaspora and the relationship between the culture of the host country and the homeland. And I argue that there is a clear connection between the ever-changing nature of Chinese food in America and diasporic theories on identity, hybridization, and a feeling of disconnectedness. In his essay, The Uses of Diaspora, Brent Hayes Edwards built upon the ideas of Stuart Hall on diaspora as articulated, as in the effects of diaspora are related to their similarities and differences. Edwards pushed this idea further to develop the concept of décalage. The term was originally used by Leopold Senghor in his essay Négro-américain et Négro-africain to highlight the differences between Black Americans and Black Africans. Edwards explains that décalage refers to unevenness, like the legs of a table that are different lengths, as well as the highlighting of that unevenness, like taking away props that keep the table stable. Diaspora functions similarly to the unbalanced table. It can be propped up or made even by prosthetic means like idealistic concepts of globalism or unity, but they are artificial. Instead of analyzing how well the prosthetics function in producing this imitation of evenness, Edwards instead proposes analyzing the effects of such prosthetics or traces of haunting. This reference point reinforces the idea of décalage. Hall identified two definitions of articulation, joining up as in the limbs of a body or the hinge of a door, but also to give expression or emphasis to. In a diasporic context, he focused on the former definition, articulation as a joint, a point of linkage, but also separation. It is this focus that Edwards applies to his concept of décalage. A joint as a metaphor for décalage emphasizes the aspects of diaspora that undergo assimilation while others resist translation, similarly to how the word itself is unable to be completely translated from French to English. It is this difference, the space between bones or members, that allows movement. It is through this lens that we can view the Chinese diaspora and Chinese cuisine as an agent of diaspora. However, diasporas are typically defined by a movement of people, not food. So how does the cuisine fit into this narrative? Contemporary diasporic theory has moved past confining diasporic studies solely to the movement of people. Culture and language are considered elements of diaspora, and according to John Peffer, art objects are also a part of diaspora. For Peffer, diaspora indicates an interweaving of cultures, and he posits that objects can be as interwoven into host cultures as the migrant themselves. Diasporic objects do this by hybridizing their subjects and their beholders in different configurations according to historical context. In this way, objects also act as décalage, in that they highlight both the linkage and the separation, the ability to assimilate, and an original location or time that no longer exists that influences the object. Peffer analyzes African sculpture and photography, and he explains that African art objects were stripped of their context and meaning to become more palatable to Western viewers. Each of the steps, locations, and iterations that the African art objects went through was a part of diaspora. Through these iterations, the object leaves an impact, a trace of itself. He describes that African visual objects are placeholders. The place they situate may be the gap between performance and memory, or between African histories and the new audiences for African objects elsewhere. If art objects can be diasporic, is it possible to translate that logic onto Chinese food? I believe that it is possible to translate that logic, especially since Chinese food is still adapting while holding on to pieces of its original form. Edwards and Peffer's diasporic theories, like I said, can readily be applied to Chinese food in America. It has adapted and evolved across the country. It is important that the food has this quality. It helps garner favor and support for immigrants that would never truly be accepted as American because they are not white. In the search for General Tso, the filmmakers visit several Chinese restaurants across the country that each have amended their recipes over time to react to their customers' tastes, like Frank Wong, a chef from Louisiana, whose restaurant serves Cajun Chinese food, including Szechuan alligator and Chinese gumbo. By rendering themselves familiar to their clientele, Chinese restaurants make themselves non-threatening. They assimilate into the local landscape while still maintaining a certain level of Chineseness or exoticism that makes Americans view them as authentic. Without this simultaneous linkage and separation from original Chinese authenticity, Chinese food would largely be irrelevant in the American culinary world. In applying Peffer's theory, Chinese food maps the history of its creators and the history of its recipes and iterations. It acts as the gap between past and present diaspora and host culture. But in order to fully be diasporic, the cuisine must have agency, the ability to make an impact or create change as it moves through time and space. Chinese food creates space for Chinese immigrants, although that inclusion does have its caveats. Chinese restaurants and the food they serve cater to Americans literally in the service they provide through taste and through adaptation of the cuisine to fit American taste buds. However, the Chinese restaurant owners must compromise themselves and their food to earn this acceptance. They must perform authenticity for their American clients while maintaining a safe level of exoticism or otherness. This hybridity can enact a cost on the diasporic identity. Lisa Lowe writes, hybridization is not the free oscillation between or among chosen identities. It is the uneven process through which immigrant communities encounter the violences of the U.S. state and the capital imperatives served by the United States and by the Asian states from which they come, and the process through which they survive those violences by living, inventing, and reproducing different cultural alternatives. Chinese food as an invention of cultural alternatives leaves a trace of itself through each iteration, evolution, and adaptation. According to Philip Chang, one of the creators of the very popular Chinese-American restaurant chain P.F. Chang's, according to him, Americans embrace certain ideas about ethnic food, but they make it their own. This syncretization is uniquely American and Chinese cuisine and culture melded together. And the melding can become even more specific based on regional tastes. This is the power of Chinese food and the simultaneous sacrifice that it must make in its host country. The phenomenon of Chinese food in America provides an ideal case study into expanding the field and theories of diaspora studies. This research has shown that the cuisine is as much of a diasporic agent as objects and people. It represents acceptance and difference, linkage and separation. It represents agency in an age of globalism and migration, as well as the losses faced by diasporic people. By demonstrating these connections and the ways in which Chinese Americans and Chinese American food must adapt to the American landscape, we can begin to unpack America's continuing racist attitudes towards Asian Americans, as well as the impact that assimilation has on immigrants in a post-globalism world. Thank you.